the back of it. Now, this slimpatan, this is the kind of knot motif that can provide endless discussion, for circulation and possible precedents and their translation, because this is quite well known in a variety of different conventions, art conventions. So you have it in Chinese art, but you also have it in Persian, chinoiserie kind of art. So the period after the Mongol conquest, when Persian art translated quite a number of Chinese motifs into Islamic use. And so then there's the question of whether this came via one or the other, or whether it was a local Javanese invention itself. So we, again, the answers are fraught with uncertainty. Yeah? But we do know that this was a favored motif in Java, this slimpatan as they call it. In Malay, it's actually called selimpat. So it's just a Javanese pronunciation, slimpatan. So it's the same word that we're talking about. And these. So one of them, maybe the most obvious when we talk about the Trans-Oceanic connection, has to do with these tiles. Because these are tiles that were made in Vietnam kilns. In kilns in what is today Vietnam. They are blue and white in to resemble the popular blue and white Ming porcelain. Of course, as some of you know, Ming porcelain itself has been discussed in quite a number of papers, the blue and white I mean, as having been an outcome of the encounter with Persian Muslims, the Persian Muslim network. The blue, the cobalt blue, is produced in a particularly brilliant dark tone that the Chinese at that point could not produce as nicely. And this depended on importing from Persia the required ingredient, and this importation itself was made possible because of the new connections that were instigated by the Mongol conquests, which then facilitated this Islamic connection to China. So the blue and white itself embeds so many layers within it, but we are here concerned with the Vietnam kilns producing the blue and white of the Ming for the Javanese market. We know that because these tiles are found nowhere else. They seem to have been produced particularly for the Javanese market, and they have been found both in pre-Islamic Javanese sites and post-conversion Islamic sites. So they were, so it's Javanese rather than, let's say, Javanese Islamic. We might be very tempted to say, oh, because it's all, no animals, and therefore it's very Islamic. The thing is, in the late Javanese period, there was already a late Javanese pre-Islamic period, in Majapahit. There was already quite a number of ornamental motifs that were devoid of animal representation. So there is that also fascination to foliate and to make vegetal. The scroll motif was already quite favored in the late pre-Islamic period of Java. And so you find also these examples on the map. Some of us may be a bit disturbed, and rightly so, by the fact that these tiles seem to have lost their original context, no? Why are they just plastered onto a blank wall like that? You'll be even more disturbed to see the next example. Astana Mantingan. Why are they just plastered randomly? Some of us with a sensibility to this motif will be thinking like, maybe it was not. It was probably not, right? It was probably not. And we keep that in mind, but as to the context, so we'll come to a possible context for these wall forms. Actually, I've written about this, but in a very brief form, in an overall survey, I've mentioned this, the wall ornamentation scheme. But for now, I want you to notice the staggering variety of forms. This is a very elaborate slimpatan, right? The knotted motif. This one is a landscape with a pavilion. Another rockeries landscape with a pavilion and a cave, meditation cave, and so on. So this is another lotus pond motif with a floating pavilion and so on. So that's the floating pavilion right there. So the variety of motifs on these plaques, stone panels. There are actually hundreds more in storage. So only a small number was set into the wall, and hundreds more exist in storage next to the mosque. So this is another big question mark. The other example that I want to bring up in passing while talking about still the Malacca question is Kudus. So this remarkable example. These are all slightly after the conquest of Malacca by the Portuguese. But I want us to have a sense of that period of the history of Nusantara, because it's not enough to just say, oh, the mosque was in stone. But actually, what do we mean by that? So actually, this is not precisely stone. As you can see, this is red brick. So red brick is seen as one of the defining features of Majapahit architecture. Majapahit used both red brick as well as stone blocks. They used both. Yeah? But I just wanted to quickly mention this. In this case, it's not stone blocks, it is red brick. Yeah? But what is remarkable about this is the multi-layeredness of the site. I mean, if you look at this, it's got a red brick tower that observers have immediately seen as resembling a tower for what we in Malay would call kentong, right? Or in Balinese, for example, they call kulkul. But the kentong in Javanese and in Malay, or the beduk, the mosque drum, it looks like that kind of tower, but it also resembles a Candi form. You can just about make out, it's a bit dark, but you can just about make out a Kala Makara arch with a blind niche here, yeah? Like a blind door portal. But then you also have this tall tajuk roof with a very prominent mustaka, and then you have this element here. In fact, it is a 1933 domed entrance addition over a gateway, a red brick gateway, a split gateway that we will look at later. But this is the kind of transition or change in our understanding of mosque architecture in the region. This is probably one of the most remarkable examples. So it's the 1918 here refers to the time when this structure was enlarged. The mosque tajuk form was enlarged. Initially, it was a very small building, and the larger building was in fact the tower, and the tower was the most prominent form. So if you think of it in terms of the vocabulary that was very comfortable for the Javanese at Kudus to use, it was this, the translation of Majapahit red brick architecture. So the question becomes the patronage. Right, so if we know the complexity of Kudus patronage, then it had to do with setting up a rival center to Demak, the main political center. This was the Imam of Demak Mosque. There was a disagreement and relocation of the Imam to Kudus. And the act of naming it as Kudus itself, Jerusalem, Al-Quds is Jerusalem, as opposed to what? Demak as Mecca. So there is this kind of politics of posturing going on. And unlike Demak, which did not use extensively the red brick Majapahit architecture, the Imam at Kudus chose to do so in a very extensive way. Yeah? So you see all of these is almost like an exposition of the possible permutations of gateway forms. And in addition, what is very interesting is that in Javanese, Buddhist and Hindu temple architecture, the true arch was not known. The true arch is understood or regarded to be something that came with Islamic architectural connections. And so then the difference is this is an Islamic / Majapahit Buddhist Hindu gateway because there's a true arch here. There are several true arches in some of the gateways. Otherwise you have the lintel, the flat bar, that would have stood for the gateway's top. But here you have a true arch. So this is the kind of complex melding together that you see in the complex. And I mentioned that originally the mosque was a small building, and in the mosque is here, the larger building. That's a tomb. The mosque would have been here in a small building that was later in 1918 enlarged and made much taller. And there are 3 gateways to get inside. So this is the second large gateway that is then covered over by that dome. The gateway is still beneath the dome. That's the dome right there. But today you can't see the gateway unless you are under the dome. Then you will see the red brick gateway. This is the third gateway inside the mosque. So because the mosque hall was extended so much, this last gateway is now within the prayer hall. So as I mentioned, the old prayer hall was very small. This is the original mihrab or prayer niche. So the mosque was closer here, and there was a space in front preceding the third gateway, first, second, third. So here we're looking at that third gateway now inside the hall. That's the enlarged 1918 mosque hall structure. And on the gateway, you see, and this is from the minaret just now, these panels, again, these panels that ornament walls, brick and stone walls. These are sometimes stone plaques in Javanese architecture, and sometimes these imported panels from Vietnamese kilns. Example of the context of some of the plates that were also immured. Now, the plates are interesting because the use of plates that are set into walls, whether they were Dutch Delft plates or Chinese Ming plates or a variety of other, so for example, Vietnamese plates, set into brick or stone walls, has a widespread distribution of use across the Indian Ocean Muslim world. So many sites in the Indian Ocean world have this practice of what we call immuring, or putting into the wall, right? These plates. So then we have to look at this as part of that family of practices across the Muslim world of the ocean. So therefore, this singular complex has just so many layers to it. Of course, I still want to allude to the ground condition of late and post Majapahit architecture. By the time we get to 1549, it is post Majapahit by a few decades. The Majapahit kingdom actually precedes and outlived Malacca. I think this is a context we often forget. It was already established by 1297, Majapahit, I mean. Malacca was only about maybe 1400, 1390s, we don't know, right? Around there. So, therefore, Majapahit is about 100 years older. It was already 100 years when Malacca was when Malacca was founded. And when Malacca was conquered by the Portuguese in 1511, Majapahit was still around. And it only got finally extinguished in 1527 or so. So, Majapahit and Malacca, just imagine that. So that's why when you look at Hikayat Hang Tuah, Salawatu Salatin, Sejarah Melayu, so much is said of Majapahit. You know, the Malays were so anxious about this gigantic neighbor, Majapahit. Yeah? So, therefore, you know, if you look at all these allusions to the architectural output of Majapahit, maybe it's time for me and us to wean ourselves of calling it Buddhist or Hindu Buddhist. It is just Javanese architecture. You know, it is the architecture that Java produced in the service of buildings they needed, palaces as well as temples, that when the conversion to Islam took place, the masons, the builders, continued to work in these conventions, but adapted and translated them in ways seen fit for Islamic use. So if you look carefully, where the huge Kala head would have been on a temple, there is none here. It's a blank. There is a scroll motif for where the Makara would be. There is also a blank where the Kala head would be, that sort of thing. So, and the niches no longer contain statues, of course. In fact, they even have a panel making it very clear that there is no intention for a statue to be in the niche. And perhaps you can see some parts of the tower may have never been completed. It seems that there was an intention to put something on some of the this is very common. Dados that are, or these panels that are left blank because for some reason ornamentation was stopped, yeah? And but the building is otherwise complete. A quick show of what I meant earlier about the connection between Demak, the political center, and the rival alternative set up by the Imam who had a disagreement. So you have a Kudus center here, which interestingly juxtaposes itself as the alternative to Demak, which considered itself somewhat like a Mecca, which you read about in Javanese texts. So these were current discourses of precedence and superiority at that time, the hierarchy. They were contesting this true architectural form, it seems. Now the Kudus Mausoleum, remember the building that I at first pointed to and then corrected myself. Now that's the mausoleum for Sunan Kudus, one of the several Wali Songos, or the so-called 9 saints. 9 is a kind of a symbolic number. The Muslim proselytizers of Java So this is the tomb of Sunan Kudus, the panel. Now this is where I wanted to point to the possible context for those tiles that you see just sitting on a blank wall. As you can see, if you look carefully, this would have been a panel, could have been a tile, could have been stonework, right? This is another one, sometimes produced as Vietnamese tiles from Vietnamese kilns. Another panel can be seen here, a cross panel here, another panel here. So can you see this? This is a panel with the reticulated ends. So this is the kind of, and this as well, many of the panels take this shape. But this is done in one material, stone, okay, with grill work. So this is the kind of wall form and the kind of placement of these panels on articulated wall surfaces. This even has modern addition of taps, which would have been probably in the past a spout from the tank, from the middle of a stone plug. Yeah. Anyway, so this is not a modern brick tank. It's apparently original from the earlier phases of building of the complex. I think I went ahead of myself by talking about the color and I didn't compare it with this. Yeah, I was referring to the color head here, yeah, and the fact that you place instead of a color head a blank curved surface. And there are other instances of such, abstraction and or blank surfaces. For example, this would have been the articulation of makara at the end, which is not found on this form. Now, there have been assertions or conjectures that this therefore is likely a Chandi converted for Islamic use. It cannot be, however, because the whole complex is oriented quite accurately to Mecca, which is remarkable for the 16th century. But quite a number of structures. Cirebon is even older, 100 years older than this. It was also very accurately oriented to Mecca. So this was not built as a Chandi converted for Islamic use. It was built on purpose by for Sunan Kudus, or maybe even for his successor. We don't actually exactly know to what extent it was exactly during his time, but we know that this therefore was built as a building to accompany a mosque complex as opposed to a Chandi. Yeah? I want us to also take note of the fact that the summit is made of wood. So in fact, this is the kind of basis, the kind of multi-tiered pyramidal hip roof was the basis of the mosque form. So the alternative to building this stone roof or brick roof, right, multi-tiered, was to build it in wood and terracotta tiles, or wood and thatch, or wood and ijuk, the fiber from the areca palm. You could use a variety of materials for the roof, but the point is that the summit of a Chandi, the multi-tiered roof form, right, in stone, is also you can also execute it in wood, and that becomes one of the starting points for a mosque hall. Another port city that we can look at for comparison is Aceh. So I mentioned earlier the stone base, the two-tiered stone base. So again, this representation here, yeah, of a mosque. So this is an example of possible rebuilding. We do know there is a rebuilding actually. So it's not just, it seems corroborated in written texts that there was a building of the mosque, a rebuilding of a larger mosque. So it seems that this is the earlier and this is the later. The drawings, of course, we have to be cautious about the exactitude or the full accuracy of these depictions. But if we are familiar with the mosque forms of the region as well as the ways in which even the Javanese themselves depict these roofs, then you can see Peter Mundy in this case is trying to get as accurate a depiction as possible. And in this case as well, this is, I think, originally not Vingbun's De Flaming, and then published by Vingbun, here it is, De Flaming. So this kind of depiction, right, again shows the tiered roof form with a stone base. So here's an illustration. Sorry, this is I thought I put the original sketch. This is a redrawn sketch. The actual is longer. It shows the Eid al-Adha procession on elephants to the mosque. This is the redrawn version of this, the Peter Mandi one. Anyway, other forms that you see in Aceh, and in this case, the forms are mute unless you refer to the written text. So in this case, we are fortunate to have the text written at that time, Bustan Salatin, which gives us not just descriptions, multiple descriptions actually, but also the names of different buildings and different parts of the building. So if you look into the details of the names of the component parts, then you realize not only the involvement of multiple symbolic reference to both Sanskrit, Arabic, and Acehnese and Malay, but also the involvement of multiple parties. So one pavilion was said to have been using people from West Asia, another using people from China, and of course that means by default everything else was built by Acehnese, but you've got these other workers employed by the Sultan to build these structures. The terms have an interesting mix of local Sanskrit terms, right? The localized Sanskrit terms from centuries before. So by the time you get to this period of the 17th century, the use of Sanskrit in Malay and Acehnese was already very entrenched and localized. And also, of course, Arabic and Acehnese and Malay terms. If you look carefully at the details, you will see the mustaka right here, for example, the finial, yeah, and a number of lotus representations of lotus buds, as well as these kinds of what in Kelantan, for example, would call this a gunungan. Yeah, this is very much what Kelantan would call a gunungan. So what I'm saying, therefore, is this kind of we are very local in our understanding rather than trans-regional, you know, when these were shared forms. So then having that kind of wider frame might be something interesting to reinvigorate the discussion of these, the circulation and translation of these motifs. And of course, the overall profile is of gunung, and they recall the kind of representations of rockeries that you saw on that plaque from Astana Mantingan earlier. Yeah? And the overall profile is meant to resemble gunung, so mountains. What is missing are the ornaments in copper, in gold, and in other metals that used to ornament these structures. Yeah? So some of them look like they lack a summit, and that's because the summit was built in metal, some metal material or another. Here's an illustration of a mosque that certainly bears a date. So it looks, you know, look at this, and it's zinc sheets replacing the original roof material. This is one of the predicaments of the region, right? Because we have renewable materials used for very old structures. If not for the fact that we have this date on this pillar, on this beam, sorry, one of the rafters actually, it would be hard put for us to believe this is old. You know, it looks like a recent construction, but in fact, it is from 1695 or 1665. And the numbers is a little bit uncertain in reading. So this is the now again, this is following on from the point I was drawing our attention to earlier, the nomenclature, the names, right? So here you have a mosque, and it's called Indrapuri. And it's part of a wider distribution of sites that are called Indra something. There's Indrapatra, Indrapuri, and Indrapurwa. Those are Sanskrit terms. And this is already the mid or late 17th century. This is long past conversion. So this is one of the things I was talking about in one of the articles I wrote, that we need to think beyond stratigraphy, you know, the idea that anything with Sanskrit overtones is a result of influence or something like that. This was a conscious decision by a Muslim ruler, already self-confident, to use Sanskrit to mark the names of their fortress mosques in the wider realm. So this is actually quite far away from the center. These were in fact 3 points that were made to symbolically represent the 3 sagi, they call it segi in standard Malay. The 3 sagi, 3 corners if you like, of Aceh's wider realm, okay? Controlled by Ule Balang or Hulu Balang in Standard Malay. So this is therefore quite highly symbolic of the domain, right? It's supposed to represent the extent of the domain. And the names chosen were Sanskrit names. Yeah. Of course, therefore it alludes to the fact that the Sultan, besides being in one case called the shadow of God or Allah on earth, right? In one reference, it uses the Persianate Muslim allusion. In this case, the king is also an Indra. Yeah, Indra. Of course, we are quite familiar with the use of Indra for kings in the Malay Peninsula as well. But here it is actually embedded into the names of these highly charged fortress mosques representing the Trisagi or the full realm of Greater Aceh. Yeah. And again, there have been some scholars who conjecture, maybe these were Chandi, right? Has to be. I mean, what else could it be? Well, the Chandi would have been oriented to Qiblat then. Quite interesting. So it's not a Chandi, it was purpose-built. Now, the claim that, or the conjecture this may have been Chandi arises from the name Indra. So there's this, then maybe it was a Chandi, because it's Indra Patra after all. Not really. So it was really built as a mosque, oriented to the Qibla quite properly. But then the choice was made quite consciously to call it various abodes of Indra. Indra Patra, Indra Purwa, Indra Puri. Okay, so coming back to the question of Malacca's form. So actually that was an excursion to just understand the context within which the missing Sultanate of Malacca, that absence, right? That lacuna in the center of our attention, what was around it? So in terms of time, Malacca is of course 15th century. So the two that are closest to Malacca would be, in time, right? In time, would be Cirebon and Demak. And Cirebon, of course, has a different roof form. At the summit is not the peak, but a ridge, right? So this is a limas roof as opposed to a tajuk or a meru. Yeah. So more likely, the mosque in Malacca was this form rather than this, because in its overall configuration, both the form as well as the column form, Cirebon is the most peculiar and standalone. It is the only example with 12 central columns. There's no other mosque in the Nusantara region that ever used, again, 12-column configuration with a limas roof. In fact, the relation between the two was again that of rivalry and establishing hierarchy. So there's even a story that tries to explain why Cirebon's mosque form is not in conformity with the Tajuk. And it's written by the faction from the Demak side, of course, the Mataram rulers of Central Java who claim lineage connection back to Demak. They wrote a story that's meant to be apocryphal, that originally Cirebon had a Tajuk roof, of course, like all normal mosques in the region. So this idea that there was a normative main mosque form. But guess what? Cirebon is not so legitimate, and so there was or rather Cirebon was struck with lightning, the mosque. Yeah? And so then they replaced the Tajuk roof, original Tajuk roof, with the flat ridge. So of course this is symbolic of saying that Cirebon therefore lost that status and had to choose a lower status form in the Javanese reckoning of forms, the Javanese hierarchy of forms. But I believe that that story is of course a fabrication on the side of this, the lineage that traces itself back to Demak, because the Cirebon structural form, like so much else of the architecture of Cirebon besides this mosque, have a variety of configurations that speak of continuities with earlier pavilion architecture, the full range of pavilion types found in Majapahit, Java. So then it is more likely that Cirebon chose to build in this peculiar form. So we've kind of ruled out the likelihood, not 100% ruled out, but we ruled out the likelihood that Malacca's mosque would have taken the Cirebon form. So more likely it is the form that today, in our understanding, is called the Demak form. So it's this dominance of the Demak model, when actually Demak was not the first and not the most important, actually. But everybody now uses the term Demak to denote this form. Yeah? But in terms of the number of roof tiers, right? So we have a question here, how many roof tiers seemingly a trivial question, but I'm using it as an excuse to take us on a journey of the number of roof tiers as a question. So if you